She was 5 years old. She had gray eyes that caught the light like still water on a cloudy morning, and blonde hair that her mother tied every single day with the same pink ribbon. Carefully, lovingly, the way only a mother who knows time is precious ever really ties anything. She had a little red bicycle she had just received as a birthday gift. She had a sketchbook she carried everywhere because she saw the whole world as something worth drawing. She had a father who kissed her forehead every morning before his shift, and a mother who watched her ride down the dirt road between the maple trees until she disappeared around the bend. And then one morning in 1957, she disappeared for real. Not around a bend, not into a classroom, not into the ordinary, unremarkable rhythms of a small Pennsylvania town on a clear autumn morning. She just vanished, into nothing, into silence, into a mystery so deep and so cold that it would take 68 years, a filing cabinet nobody opened, and one investigative journalist with a habit of reading every single footnote to even begin to crack it open. Her name was Mia Thompson, and this is her story. Welcome to CrimeTime, Cold Case. I'm glad you're here, because what you are about to hear is not just a tragedy. It is a reckoning. It is the story of a little girl who has failed, not once, not twice, but over and over again across nearly 7 decades, by a system that looked at the evidence, looked away, and called it a cold case. It is the story of a mother who never stopped believing, a community that never fully healed, a suspect who walked free for reasons that still don't sit right, and one overlooked line in a document nobody bothered to read twice, a line that may finally, after all this time, tell us what really happened on that road. So before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications. Because on this channel, we do not let cases go cold. We pull every thread. We read every page. And we do not stop until we have answers. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from tonight. We have viewers from all over the world, and every single one of you matters to this community. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to Mia Thompson, you have to understand Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, in the year 1957. Because the town itself, its rhythms, its silences, its deep and unshakable faith that nothing truly terrible could happen here, is as much a part of this story as any suspect or clue. Small towns in post-war America existed in a particular kind of bubble. The war was over. The boys had come home. The economy was humming. Families were settling into houses, planting gardens, buying televisions, having children. The threat of the wider world, communism, nuclear bombs, the restless stirring of a culture on the edge of enormous change, felt very far away from a place like Mill Creek, where the biggest news of the week was usually printed in 4 short columns in the Huntington Daily News, and where neighbors still greeted each other by first name every single morning. Mill Creek was a place of wooden houses and dusty roads. It was a place where the post office sat at the center of town, like a small, solid heartbeat, and where children rode their bicycles past it every morning on their way to school without a second thought. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked, not out of naivety, but out of genuine, deep-rooted trust. The kind of trust that takes generations to build and only one terrible morning to destroy. The hills surrounding the town were covered in maple trees that blazed red and orange every October, and the mornings carried a particular kind of light in autumn, low and golden and impossibly beautiful, the kind of light that makes everything look like it belongs on a postcard. In the evenings, people sat on their porches. In the mornings, they nodded to each other across the road. In between, they worked and raised their children and went to church on Sundays and believed, with every fiber of their being, that their children were safe. That belief was not foolishness. It was community. It was the lived experience of a place that had never had reason to doubt itself. But every community has its edges. Every town has its blind spots. And Mill Creek, for all its warmth and all its familiarity, had both. On the edge of town, just past the last stretch of maple trees, there was a dirt road that wound between the hillside and a row of old wooden fences. On that road, in a white-painted house with a weathered tin roof, lived the Thompson family. Thomas Thompson, Margaret Thompson, and their only daughter, 5-year-old Mia. Thomas Thompson was not a man of many words. He had served in the military during the war. The details of his service were something he rarely spoke about, even to Margaret, and he had come home carrying the particular quiet that settles into men who have seen things they cannot unsee. He worked at the steel plant in Altoona. Long shifts that started before the sun came up and ended after the light had already faded from the hills. He rose early every morning, brewed black coffee, strong, no sugar, no compromise, and moved through the house with a kind of careful, deliberate purpose. He was not a cold man. He loved his wife. He loved his daughter fiercely. But he expressed that love in the way that men of his generation had been taught to express it, through presence, through protection, through the act of showing up every single day without complaint. He read the newspaper at breakfast. He fixed things around the house on weekends. He drove a reliable truck and kept it clean. He was, by every account of every neighbor who knew him, a good man, a steady man, the kind of man you would want living on your road. Margaret Thompson was different, not in her values, but in her energy. Where Thomas was quiet, Margaret was attentive, watchful. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything, who remembered everything, who believed that the small details of daily life were worth paying attention to because they added up to something. She gave piano lessons from the living room of their house, and her students ranged from the very young to the middle-aged because in a town without many diversions, the ability to play an instrument was something people genuinely wanted. She was patient with all of them. She was organized. She kept a little notebook, small, brown-covered, filled with her careful handwriting, in which she jotted down everything from lesson schedules to grocery lists to observations about the weather. It was a habit she had picked up from her own mother, and one she found deeply comforting. The notebook was her way of making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. And then there was Mia, 5 years old, gray eyes, blonde hair always tied with a pink ribbon, a laugh that neighbors described years later as the kind that made you stop what you were doing and smile whether you wanted to or not. She was the center of the Thompson household, not in a spoiled or indulged way, but in the way that only children can be, unconsciously, effortlessly, simply by being alive and curious and endlessly, joyfully present. Mia loved to draw. She had carried a small sketchbook since she was old enough to hold a pencil properly, and she filled its pages with drawings of everything she observed, flowers she found along the road, the faces of neighbors she passed each morning, the shapes of clouds, the way light fell through the maple leaves in October. She had the particular gift of a child who has not yet been told that the world has a limited number of things worth paying attention to. To Mia, everything was worth drawing. Everything was worth noticing. She had started school that year. It was, by all accounts, going well. She liked her teacher. She liked her classmates. She was the kind of child who adapted to new environments with an ease that made her parents quietly, gratefully proud. Every morning, she rode her little red bicycle, the birthday gift she had received just weeks before and had not once been separated from since, down the dirt road between the maple trees, alone, just over a mile to school. She stopped sometimes to pick flowers. She waved to the neighbors she passed. She arrived at school with color in her cheeks from the ride, and her sketchbook tucked in her backpack alongside her schoolbooks. It was a routine. It was ordinary. It was the kind of morning that happens thousands of times in thousands of small American towns, and nobody thinks twice about it because nothing ever goes wrong. Until it does. The morning of October 14th, 1957, began exactly like every other morning that had come before it. The sky was clear, the autumn air carrying that particular edge that sits just below cold but has not quite arrived there yet. A light mist still clung to the grass in the yard when Thomas stepped outside to start his truck. The radio in the kitchen played a children's program, bright, cheerful voices reading a story about a bear who wanted to learn to fish. The smell of coffee and toast filled the house. Margaret made breakfast. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the Huntington Daily News, reading quietly, the way he always did. Mia sat across from him, eating her toast, her sketchbook on the chair beside her, even at the breakfast table, because some habits are too ingrained to break, even for meals. At some point during breakfast, this detail would be repeated in every interview Margaret gave over the following decades, because she turned it over in her mind so many times it had worn grooves. Mia looked up at her father and asked, in the perfectly direct, unself-conscious way of a 5-year-old, "Daddy, do you have a night shift today?" Thomas looked up from his newspaper. He told her no. He had the morning shift. He would be home by evening. Mia nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her toast. Thomas finished his coffee, folded his newspaper, stood up from the table, and kissed Mia on the forehead. It was the last time he ever touched her. He left for work. The door closed behind him. The truck started up and pulled away down the road. Margaret cleaned up the breakfast things, then helped Mia into her jacket, retied the pink ribbon in her hair. Tighter this time, she always said, because the ribbon had a habit of working loose by mid-morning, and helped her into her backpack. She wheeled the little red bicycle out from the side of the house into the yard and set it in front of Mia. And then she watched her daughter ride away, down the dirt road, between the 2 rows of maple trees, the red bicycle bright against the brown and gold of the fallen leaves, the pink ribbon catching the morning light, the sketchbook bumping gently against Mia's back in the backpack, smaller and smaller as she rode further away, until she turned the gentle bend at the end of the road and disappeared from view. Margaret stood in the yard for a moment. Then she went inside and began preparing for her first piano lesson of the day. She would never see her daughter again. 2 houses down the road from the Thompsons, a woman named Emma Fielding was doing what she did most mornings, watering the plants on her front porch before the day got too busy. Emma Fielding was in her mid-40s, a widow who had lived on that road for nearly 20 years, and she knew every face, every vehicle, every routine that moved past her house with the ease of someone who has paid attention to the same small stretch of the world for a very long time. She saw Mia ride past. She recognized her immediately. The blonde hair, the pink ribbon, the red bicycle, the determined way she pedaled, all of it utterly familiar. She might have waved. She was not entirely certain, in the years that followed, whether she actually waved or whether she had simply intended to and been distracted before she could. It was the kind of detail that haunts witnesses for the rest of their lives. The ordinary moment they did not know would become extraordinary, the last clear image of a child who was about to vanish. But there was something else Emma Fielding saw that morning. Something she mentioned almost as an aside when the police first interviewed her. Something she said so casually, so without emphasis, that the officer who took down her statement noted it in a single line and moved on. Behind Mia, moving slowly along the same stretch of road, was an old green pickup truck. Not racing, not erratic, just moving slowly, more slowly than you would expect for that road at that time of morning, when most people heading anywhere were moving with purpose. The truck came to the intersection at the end of the road, hesitated, paused, just for a moment, just long enough to be slightly wrong, and then turned down a parallel side road that ran between the back of the properties and the edge of the tree line. Emma Fielding looked at it for a moment, then looked away. She assumed it was a delivery truck. Maybe someone making a drop-off to one of the houses further down. Nothing alarming. Nothing worth a second look. She went back to her watering, and a little girl with a pink ribbon in her hair and a sketchbook in her backpack rode out of sight and out of the world as her family had known it. The rest of that morning passed in the ordinary rhythms of a town that did not yet know anything was wrong. Margaret Thompson gave her first piano lesson of the day, the notes drifting out through the living room windows into the cool October air. Mrs. Fielding finished her watering and went inside. Other neighbors went about their days, to work, to shops, to errands, to the 10,000 small transactions of an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small Pennsylvania town. It was not until late morning, approaching noon, that the first tremor of wrongness made itself felt. Margaret had finished her lesson and moved to the kitchen to begin preparing lunch. It was a routine so deeply ingrained she could do it without thinking, and it was precisely because she was not thinking that the silence of the house registered so sharply. She stood at the kitchen counter and felt it. Not heard it, felt it. The particular, weighted absence that a parent recognizes not as the absence of noise, but as the absence of presence. Mia should have been home. School let out at midday on Tuesdays. Mia always rode straight home. She had never been late before. Never. Not once. Margaret checked the clock on the wall. The hands confirmed what she already knew. Too much time had passed. She told herself, briefly, that there was a simple explanation. Mia had stopped to pick flowers. She had met a friend on the road. She had found something worth drawing and had set down her bicycle in the leaves and was sitting somewhere along the maple-lined stretch with her sketchbook open on her knees, completely absorbed, completely safe, completely unaware that her mother was standing in the kitchen with a growing cold feeling spreading upward from her stomach. Margaret put on her coat and went outside. She walked the dirt road between the maple trees, calling Mia's name. At first, her voice was calm, the measured, carrying voice of a mother summoning a child who is nearby and simply distracted. It echoed off the tree trunks and came back to her empty. She kept walking. She called again, louder this time, the calm beginning to fracture around the edges. The sun slanted through the trees at the low October angle, casting long shadows across the road. Dry leaves covered the ground on both sides, undisturbed. No bicycle tracks, no scattered flowers, no small figure crouched over a sketchbook. No answer. The road bent and straightened and bent again, and at every turn Margaret's voice grew louder and her steps grew faster, and the cold feeling in her chest spread and deepened until it was no longer a feeling but a certainty. She reached the point where the road met the main street. She looked in both directions. Nothing. She crossed to the other side and walked back, looking into the trees, calling and calling. Still nothing. By the time she returned to the house, Margaret Thompson knew, with the absolute, wordless knowledge that bypasses rational thought entirely and speaks directly to something older and more fundamental, that something had happened to her daughter. She went inside and called the police. The Huntingdon County Sheriff's Department responded quickly. Officers arrived at the Thompson house within the hour, took down the details Margaret provided. Mia's description, her route, the time she had left, the time she was expected home, and immediately began organizing a search of the road and the surrounding area. Word spread through the town with the particular speed that bad news always travels in small communities. Carried from house to house by phone calls and front porch conversations and the sight of police cruisers moving slowly down the dirt road between the maple trees. By early afternoon, nearly 24 residents had joined the search. They combed the tree line on both sides of the road. They searched the yards of the houses along the route. They called Mia's name across the fields and into the hills. They found nothing. No bicycle, no backpack, no escape walk, no pink ribbon. No sign that a small girl had come this way at all that morning, except for the memory of one neighbor who had watched her ride past and had not thought to watch where she went. Thomas Thompson was pulled from his shift at the plant and arrived home to find his wife sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by police officers and neighbors, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her face the color of old paper. He was a man who controlled himself, who did not break in public, who had trained himself in the years since the war to absorb terrible information without visible reaction. But the people who were there that afternoon, neighbors, officers, the school principal who had come to offer what comfort she could, they all said the same thing later. They said that when Thomas Thompson walked through that door and understood that his daughter was missing, something went out of him that never came back. The search continued into the evening and beyond. Lanterns and flashlights moved through the dark between the trees. Names were called into the cold October night. And as the hours accumulated with no sign of Mia, the mood of the town shifted from urgent to fearful, from fearful to something heavier that nobody had a precise word for, because this was not the kind of thing that happened in Mill Creek. This was not something for which anyone in this town had a frame of reference. By the time dawn broke on October 15th, Mia Thompson had been missing for nearly 24 hours, and not a trace of her had been found. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. The Huntingdon County Sheriff's Department brought in additional officers. The FBI was notified. In those days, child abduction cases triggered federal involvement quickly. Roadblocks were set up on the routes out of town. Descriptions were circulated across the county and then across the state. Newspapers picked up the story. The Thompson family's telephone rang constantly. Tips, sightings, condolences, the inevitable fringe element that attaches itself to any high-profile missing persons case with reports of having seen the child in a dozen different places, none of which checked out. Mia's photograph ran on the front page of the Huntington Daily News. It was a school photograph. She was looking directly at the camera with the slight self-consciousness of a child who is trying very hard to smile correctly. And the result was an expression that stopped somewhere between a smile and something more wistful, more uncertain. It was the photograph that appeared in every subsequent report, every anniversary story, every cold case database entry over the decades that followed. The gray eyes, the blonde hair, the pink ribbon. Investigators conducted interviews up and down the road. They spoke to Emma Fielding again, and this time they pressed her more carefully on what she had seen that morning. She described the green pickup truck again. Old, she said, not new, the kind of truck that had been on the road for a while. She could not give them a model or a year with any precision. She could not give them a license plate. She had not looked closely enough. She had assumed it was a delivery truck, and assumptions are the enemy of observation. But what she said next was the detail that sent investigators in a specific direction. She thought she knew whose truck it was. Raymond Holt. Raymond Holt was 34 years old in 1957. He had lived in Mill Creek for approximately 8 years, having arrived from somewhere in western Pennsylvania. Nobody was entirely sure where, and Holt was not the kind of man who volunteered information about his past. He rented a small property 2 houses down the road from the Thompsons, where he operated out of a garage attached to the back of the house, doing mechanical work, repairs, maintenance, the kind of general automotive work that was always in demand in a working-class town where people kept their vehicles running as long as possible because new ones were expensive. He was not well-liked. This was a consistent thread in every account of Raymond Holt from everyone who knew him, and the precision with which people described their discomfort with him is worth noting. They were not describing someone who was obviously threatening. They were not describing someone who had made explicit statements or committed witnessed acts of any kind. They were describing something more subtle and more unsettling, a quality of attention that felt wrong, a way of watching. Several neighbors, in their statements to police, used almost identical language. He watched. He watched the children on the road. He watched from his garage. He watched from his front steps. His gaze would follow a child down the road and stay on them longer than was comfortable, longer than was normal, longer than any of the neighbors could quite explain, but all of them could feel. Nobody had ever reported him. Nobody had ever confronted him. In the culture of that time and that place, the instinct was to keep a private eye on someone like that, to mention it quietly to other mothers, to steer your children slightly away from his property, but not to make it official, not to formalize the discomfort because you had no evidence, because you did not want to be the person who caused trouble for a man who had technically never done anything wrong. He drove an old green pickup truck. He was single, solitary, without close friends or known family in the area. He went to the diner in town occasionally, but ate alone. He bought his groceries at the general store, paid cash, said little. He was, in retrospect, the archetypal person who exists in the margins of a community, present enough to be familiar, absent enough to remain a stranger, known to everyone and truly known by no one. When police came to his door on October 15th, the day after Mia disappeared, Holt answered their questions with what was described as cooperative flatness. He said he had been home the previous morning. He said he had taken his truck out briefly. For parts, he said he needed a specific part for a repair job he was working on. He said he had not seen Mia Thompson that morning. He said he did not know what had happened to her. He was not, at that point, charged with anything. There was no evidence connecting him directly to Mia's disappearance. Only Emma Fielding's uncertain identification of a green pickup truck that might have been his, might have been someone else's, might have been exactly what she initially assumed it was, a delivery truck with no connection to anything. Police kept an eye on Holt. They made note of his truck, his movements, his account of his whereabouts. They filed it. 3 days after Mia Thompson disappeared, Raymond Holt left Mill Creek. No notice, no forwarding address, no explanation given to neighbors or to the man he rented his property from, who found the house empty and the garage tools packed up and gone when he came to collect October's rent. Holt's name did not appear on any outgoing mail. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He simply was there, and then was not, and the space he left behind felt significantly different from the ordinary way that people move on from small towns. When police learned he had gone, The calculus of the investigation shifted immediately and completely. A man who had been a peripheral person of interest, someone with a possibly relevant vehicle and a reputation for unsettling behavior, became, overnight, the prime suspect. An alert went out for Raymond Holt. His description was circulated. His vehicle description was updated and widened. Investigators worked to trace his background, to find out where he had come from and where he might have gone, to build enough of a picture of the man to predict his movements. What they found was a picture full of gaps. Holt's background prior to his arrival in Mill Creek was difficult to verify. The address he had given when he rented his property checked out to a real location in western Pennsylvania, but the people at that address said they had not heard from him in years. He had no criminal record in Pennsylvania. Investigators checked this immediately. He had no known relatives in the state. He had not filed taxes in several years, which was unusual but not, in itself, a crime. He was a man who had made himself difficult to follow backward in time, and who had now made himself impossible to follow forward. The search for Raymond Holt continued. It continued for months, and then for years, and eventually it became the quiet, persistent background hum of a case that had no momentum, no body, no weapon, no witnesses, no evidence, just a man who had run and a little girl who had vanished, and the terrible, unanswerable question of whether those two facts were connected or whether the connection was nothing more than terrible timing. Because here is the brutal truth about the investigation into Mia Thompson's disappearance. It never really had anything solid to stand on. The law requires evidence. It requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. It requires a chain of facts that connects a person to an act in a way that a jury can follow and a judge can sanction. And in the case of Mia Thompson, there was no chain. There was a green pickup truck that may or may not have been Raymond Holt's. There was a man who had left town at an unfortunate time. There was a community's intuition about his character, which was deeply felt and entirely inadmissible. And there was the absence, total, absolute, devastating absence, of a body, which meant there was not even confirmation that a crime had occurred. The case stalled. Investigators checked in on it periodically over the following years. New leads came in occasionally. A sighting of a green pickup in another county, a tip about a man matching Holt's description working at a garage in another state, reports from 3 different locations that were investigated and found to lead nowhere. Each time, the case file was opened, examined, and closed again. Each time, it went back into the filing cabinet. Each time, it collected a little more dust and a little more silence. Thomas Thompson died in 1972, 15 years after his daughter vanished, without having received any answer about what had happened to her. He was 53 years old. His death certificate listed the cause as a heart condition, which was true in the strictly medical sense. But the people who knew him, Margaret, the neighbors who had watched him age in fast forward in the months after October 1957, would have told you that what killed Thomas Thompson was grief. The slow, relentless, quiet kind that does not announce itself, but simply empties a person from the inside, year by year, until there is not enough left to sustain a heartbeat. Margaret Thompson outlived her husband by more than 3 decades. She stayed in the house with a weathered tin roof. She kept giving piano lessons until her hands made it impossible. She kept her daughter's file on the kitchen table, not as a shrine or a memorial, but as a working document, a living record of everything that had been done and everything that had not. She wrote letters to the sheriff's department, to the FBI, to newspapers, to anyone who might be able to tell her something. She collected every report, every news story, every theory that came her way, and she read them all carefully and filed them in their proper place, and wrote a note in her little notebook about each one. She never believed her daughter was dead. This was not denial. Margaret Thompson was not a woman given to self-deception, and she was too precise, too observant, too deeply committed to the truth to look away from the evidence that Mia had almost certainly not survived whatever had happened on that road. But she could not permit herself certainty, because certainty in either direction would require her to stop, and stopping was something Margaret Thompson was incapable of. She died in 2004 at the age of 81. She never received her answer. She never got to know what happened to her daughter. But someone else was about to find out. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this shocking story, because what comes next changes everything you just heard. Her name has not been publicly released in connection with the case. In the court documents and official communications that began to circulate years after her initial investigation, she is referred to simply and consistently as the investigative journalist. She had spent the better part of 15 years covering cold cases across Pennsylvania. Not for a major publication, not for a network, but for a regional magazine that took the kind of long, careful, deeply sourced approach to its journalism that had become increasingly rare, the kind where a single story might take a year of reporting to complete, where every fact was checked and checked again, where the archive was not an afterthought, but the foundation. She had come across the Thompson case in the way that journalists often come across the cases that define their careers, obliquely, sideways, through a reference in something else she was researching. She had been working on a piece about unsolved child disappearances in rural Pennsylvania in the 1950s and 60s, a broader survey piece that required her to pull dozens of case files from county archives across the state. The Thompson file was one among many when she first requested it. It was not, initially, anything more than one data point in a larger pattern she was trying to map, but something about it nagged at her. She could not have told you, in those early weeks, what the something was. It was not a specific detail. Nothing she had read so far had jumped out at her as obviously wrong or overlooked. It was more a quality of incompleteness that bothered her, a sense that the file was telling her a story with a gap in it that nobody had noticed or named. She had spent enough years reading case files to know the difference between a cold case that was cold because the evidence had been exhausted and a cold case that was cold because the investigation had stopped looking in the right places. The Thompson file felt like the second kind. She requested the complete file. The original, not the summary. All of it. Every statement, every report, every piece of correspondence, every document that had been added to the case record across the 6 decades since Mia's disappearance. It was substantial. Hundreds of pages accumulated over more than 60 years of periodic attention, organized in the particular fashion of a filing system that had been maintained by multiple people across multiple decades, which is to say, not perfectly. She read every page, every statement, every report. She read the interview transcripts of the neighbors who had been questioned in the first days of the investigation. She read the FBI's initial assessment. She read the follow-up reports from the 1960s and 70s when tips had come in and been investigated. She read the correspondence between Margaret Thompson and the sheriff's department, spanning decades, the letters becoming shorter and more formal over time as bureaucratic language learned to absorb grief without responding to it. She read the property records for the road, the tax documents, the map surveys. She read the footnotes. She was, by her own account, in an interview she gave years later, 3/4 of the way through the file, tired, running on cold coffee, sitting in the archive room of the Huntingdon County Courthouse at a table covered in photocopies, when she turned a page and read a line that made her sit up straight. It was buried in a property survey document, not a police document, not an investigative report. A property survey, the kind of technical document generated by a licensed surveyor in the course of resolving a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring landowners. This particular survey had been commissioned in November of 1957, approximately 6 weeks after Mia's disappearance, in connection with an ongoing dispute about the exact location of the property line between 2 farms on the eastern edge of town. It was a document that had been added to the case file, apparently by someone who had included all potentially relevant property documents in the area at the time, and had sat there unread and unexamined in any meaningful sense for more than 60 years. The surveyor, a man named Gerald Houck, who had been licensed in Huntingdon County since 1949, had done his work with the thoroughness of a man who took his profession seriously. He had measured the boundaries, noted the landmarks, documented the condition of the land. And on page 7 of his 12-page report, in a paragraph that concerned the western edge of the property in question, he had written a single sentence that had apparently not registered as significant to anyone who had ever glanced at this document. He noted the presence of what he described as a recently disturbed plot of earth, approximately 4 feet by 2 feet, located at the tree line, adjacent to what the survey identified as the old Miller property. 4 feet by 2 feet. The investigative journalist stared at that line for a long time. Then she turned to the next page of the file. The survey had been received by the sheriff's department. There was a routing stamp on the cover page. Received, dated, filed. Someone had read it, or at least touched it. Someone had decided it was not relevant, or perhaps had not thought to consider it in the context of a missing 5-year-old girl, or perhaps had read it on a busy day and made a mental note to follow up and then never had because the case was cold and the trail was old and there was always something more immediate demanding attention. Nobody had ever gone to look at that plot of earth. Nobody had ever ordered a forensic examination of that location. Nobody had flagged the measurement. 4 feet by 2 feet, approximately the dimensions of a grave for a small child, and connected it to the girl who had disappeared on a road less than 3/4 of a mile from the old Miller property 6 weeks before the surveyor walked that ground. She put the document down on the table. She put her hands flat on the surface, the way Margaret Thompson had put her hands flat on the kitchen table when the police arrived that afternoon in October of 1957. She sat there for a long time, and then she picked up her phone and started making calls. What followed the journalist's discovery was a process that moved simultaneously faster and slower than anyone wanted. Faster, because once she had alerted the appropriate authorities to the existence of the surveyor's notation, the renewed investigation took on an urgency that had been absent from this case for decades. Slower, because the machinery of justice and law enforcement in a cold case involves an enormous amount of institutional caution, legal consideration, and bureaucratic process that cannot be accelerated simply because a journalist has found something significant. The first call she made was to the Huntingdon County Sheriff's Department. She reached a detective who had joined the department relatively recently, a man named Daniel Marsh who had, it turned out, heard of the Thompson case, but had never worked on it directly. She explained what she had found. She was careful. She did not editorialize or speculate. She read him the relevant passage from the survey document and provided the precise location referenced in the text. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Detective Marsh asked if she could come the following morning. She was there at 8 o'clock. The meeting lasted several hours. The journalist brought copies of the relevant documents. Marsh and another detective reviewed them, cross-referenced them with the original case file, consulted with the county's legal team about what would be required to authorize an examination of the reference location. The old Miller property had changed hands multiple times over the decades. The current owners had purchased it in the mid-1990s and had no knowledge of the 1957 case. Getting permission to access the property, to conduct what might amount to an archaeological examination of a 68-year-old potential crime scene, was not a simple matter. But it happened. Slowly, procedurally, with all the appropriate legal authorizations in place, it happened. The examination of the tree-lean area adjacent to the old Miller property was conducted approximately 4 months after the journalist's discovery, in early spring, when the ground had softened enough to make excavation possible. It was carried out by a forensic team under the supervision of the county's medical examiner, with Detective Marsh and 2 other investigators present, and with the entire area secured under a formal scene of crime designation. What they found is the subject of ongoing legal proceedings that have not yet concluded at the time of this telling. The full details have not been publicly released, but the following is a matter of public record. The forensic team found evidence of a disturbance at the location described in the 1957 survey. The disturbance was consistent with having occurred at approximately the same time as the survey had been conducted. Soil composition analysis, root growth patterns, and other forensic indicators all pointed to the late autumn of 1957. The location matched the surveyor's description precisely. Whether the remains of Mia Thompson are among what was found at that location is something that has not yet been formally confirmed by the relevant authorities, because the biological analysis required to make such a determination in material of this age is painstaking and time-consuming and must be conducted with the kind of care that cannot be rushed without compromising the results. What has been confirmed is that Raymond Holt, the mechanic who drove an old green pickup truck and left Mill Creek without a word 3 days after Mia Thompson disappeared, is still alive. He is in his late 80s. He is living under a different name in a different state. He was located through a combination of forensic genealogy techniques, the same methods that have cracked open dozens of cold cases in recent years by tracing DNA through family databases and old-fashioned investigative work, following the thread of a life that had tried very hard to disappear. He has not yet been charged. The investigation is ongoing. The legal process is moving one careful, deliberate step at a time toward whatever conclusion it is going to reach. But for the first time in 68 years, the case of Mia Thompson is no longer cold. Let's go back for a moment to Margaret Thompson, to the image of her at the kitchen table, hands flat on the surface, face the color of old paper, to the image of her walking the maple-lined road in her coat, calling her daughter's name with growing urgency, to the image of her in her later years, with the case file on the kitchen table in front of her, reading and rereading and writing careful notes in her little brown notebook, never stopping, never permitting herself the certainty of grief, because certainty would require her to stop. She died in 2004 without knowing what happened to her daughter. She died without knowing that 68 years later, a journalist would read a footnote that everyone else had skipped over, that a forensic team would walk the tree line adjacent to the old Miller property and find what the surveyor had noted and no one had followed up on, that Raymond Holt, the quiet, watching man who drove a green pickup truck and left without a word, will be found living under a different name in a different state, alive into his late 80s, having carried whatever he carried for all of this time. She did not live to see any of it. There is something about that fact that resists the comfort of narrative resolution. We tell stories about cold cases, in part because we want to believe that justice is possible, that time and truth and human persistence can eventually close even the most stubbornly open wounds. And in the case of Mia Thompson, something like justice may yet come. The investigation is ongoing. The process is moving. The law is doing what it was designed to do, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. But Margaret Thompson did not live to see it. Thomas Thompson did not live to see it. Mia Thompson herself, if what the forensic team found at the tree line adjacent to the old Miller property is confirmed to be her remains, did not live past a single October morning in 1957, when she rode her little red bicycle down a maple-lined road with a pink ribbon in her hair and a sketchbook in her backpack, and the world as she knew it ended before she had barely begun to know it. These are the things that true crime, at its best, holds on to. Not just the puzzle, not just the procedural, not just the satisfying click of a case closing. The people, the specific, irreplaceable, unbearable reality of a little girl who loved to draw, who asked her father if he had the night shift, who ate her toast and had her ribbon retied and rode away down the road and never came back. The case of Mia Thompson is not just a mystery. It is a reckoning with everything that went wrong, with the investigation that stalled, with the document that nobody followed up on, with the years and decades that accumulated while a mother wrote letters to a department that filed them and moved on, with a man who left town and became a different man with a different name in a different place and apparently went on living his life. And it is perhaps a reminder that cold cases are only cold because someone stopped looking, that the details matter, all of them, even the ones in property surveys conducted for unrelated reasons, even the footnotes, even the asides, that a single line, 4 feet by 2 feet, recently disturbed at the tree line, can mean everything if someone is willing to read it. Let us also sit with something that tends to get lost in the telling of cases like this one. The particular texture of a community after a child goes missing from it and is never found. Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, in the weeks and months after October 14th, 1957, was not the same town it had been before. That is not a metaphor. It is something that can be documented and observed in the concrete ways that a community changes when the foundational assumption that children are safe, that nothing terrible happens here, that the world between these hills is a protected and knowable place, is abruptly and permanently removed. Mothers who had let their children walk or ride to school alone no longer did so. Children who had spent their afternoons roaming freely between properties, along roads, through the tree lines at the edge of town, were called inside earlier. Doors that had never been locked began to be locked. The nods between neighbors in the morning, the easy, trusting acknowledgement that characterized life on that road became something more complicated, more searching. People looked at each other differently. They looked at the green pickup trucks parked in driveways differently. They looked at the quiet, solitary man who did not quite fit into the fabric of the community, and they thought about what they had not done, what they had not said, what they had assumed and walked away from. Emma Fielding, who had seen the truck and assumed it was a delivery, gave interviews to the local newspaper several times over the years. In every one of them, she returned to the same moment: the intersection, the truck pausing, her turning away. She had replayed it 10,000 times. She knew, rationally, that she could not have been expected to act on what she had observed. She had not known, she could not have known, it had looked like nothing. But rational knowledge and emotional knowledge occupy different rooms in the mind. And in the emotional room, Emma Fielding spent decades in that moment, watching that truck pause at the intersection and wondering what would have happened if she had not turned away. That is the secondary wound of a case like this one. The grief of the family is its own enormous and irreducible thing, and it belongs to them. But the town carries something too. The witnesses carry something. The neighbors who nodded past Raymond Holt's garage every morning and felt the wrongness of his watching and said nothing because they had nothing to say. They carry something. The investigators who received the property survey and did not connect it to the missing girl, whatever became of them, whatever long careers and retirements and private lives they went on to have, they carry something too, even if they never knew they were carrying it. Cold cases do not stay cold because nobody cares. They stay cold because the gaps between caring and doing are filled with the ordinary human limitations of time and attention and institutional momentum, and those gaps accumulate. And what accumulates in them is silence, and silence is what a case disappears into. The investigative journalist, in the same interview in which she described her discovery, was asked what she thought about when she turned that page and read the surveyor's note. She said she thought about 3 things in rapid succession in a matter of seconds. She thought about the measurement, 4 feet by 2 feet, the dimensions of a small child's grave. She thought about the 6 weeks between Mia's disappearance and the survey, long enough for the earth to settle slightly, to begin to look like disturbance rather than fresh excavation, long enough for the leaves to fall and cover the ground, but not long enough, apparently, for the surveyor not to notice. And she thought about Margaret Thompson, whom she had read about extensively in the course of her research, about the little notebook, about the letters, about the case file on the kitchen table. She thought about what it would have meant to Margaret to have known, even in her last years, even after Thomas was gone and the house was quieter than it had ever been, to have known that someone had found something, that the search was not over, that Mia had not simply been swallowed by the silence. She could not, obviously, tell Margaret Thompson. Margaret Thompson had been dead for years by the time the journalist sat in that archive room and turned that page. But she said, and she said it in a way that made very clear she had thought about it carefully and chosen her words deliberately. She said that she felt, in some way she could not entirely explain, that the finding was for Margaret as much as for anyone else, that the detail was waiting to be found, that it had been there all along, patient in the file, in the footnotes, waiting for someone who read everything. There is another thread in this story that has not yet been fully pulled, and it runs through the question of how Raymond Holt managed to disappear so effectively for so many years. In 1957, the tools available to law enforcement for tracking a fugitive were substantially more limited than they are today. There were no digital records, no electronic financial trails, no national databases that could be queried in seconds. There was paper. There were phone calls. There were physical descriptions circulated to other departments via teletype. There was the fundamental difficulty of finding a man who had decided to be someone else in a country large enough to absorb that kind of disappearance without much effort. Holt, or whatever name he was going by in the weeks after he left Mill Creek, appears to have understood this. He did not go to another small town in Pennsylvania where he might be recognized. He went somewhere that had no connection to his previous life, somewhere he could establish himself as a new person with a new name and a new history, and where the passage of time would do the rest. He did not stay in contact with anyone from Mill Creek. He left no trail that led back to himself. He built a real life, apparently, with neighbors and routines, and whatever constitutes normalcy for a man carrying whatever Raymond Holt was carrying. And he lived it for nearly 7 decades without being found. The forensic genealogy techniques that ultimately led investigators to him are worth understanding, because they represent one of the most significant developments in cold case investigation of the past 20 years, and they're the reason that cases which were previously considered permanently closed are being reopened at a striking rate. The basic principle is this. When a person submits their DNA to a consumer genealogy service, the kinds that tell you your ancestry and connect you with relatives, that DNA does not only tell you about yourself. It tells investigators about your biological relatives, including relatives who have never submitted their own DNA. By identifying DNA matches in a genealogy database and then mapping the family tree outward from those matches, investigators can gradually narrow the field of possible sources for a DNA sample collected at a crime scene, eventually identifying an individual who may never have thought that their own voluntary submission to a consumer service would become relevant to a 68-year-old criminal investigation. This is the methodology that has cracked cases like the Golden State Killer and dozens of others. Cases that have been cold for decades, cases in which the evidence existed but the technology to make use of it did not, until it did. In the case of Mia Thompson, the DNA evidence involved was found at the scene, not at the Trillian location, which came later, but at an earlier point in the reinvestigation that has not yet been made fully public. What can be said is that forensic genealogy led investigators to Raymond Holt's current identity through a biological relative who had no knowledge of their family member's past, and that the confirmation of identity was made through surveillance and subsequent comparison rather than direct confrontation. Holt was found. He is alive. He is in his late 80s. He has not yet been charged. Whether he'll be charged, whether he is capable of standing trial, whether the evidence now being assembled will be sufficient to meet the legal threshold required. These are questions that the investigation and the legal process will determine, in their own time and according to their own standards. They are not questions this story can answer definitively, because they have not yet been definitively answered. But they're being asked. For the first time in 68 years, they are genuinely, actively, seriously being asked. There is a school in Mill Creek today. Not the same building that Mia Thompson was riding toward on the morning she disappeared. That building was long ago replaced, but a school nonetheless, and children still ride bicycles down the roads between the maple trees in the mornings, and mothers still watch them go from their front yards and their porches, and the town still has the particular quality of a place that has been through something and carried it forward. Mill Creek is not the same town it was in 1957. Nowhere is. But the story of Mia Thompson is woven into the town in ways that do not fully announce themselves. In the particular carefulness with which parents in that community have raised their children for generations, in the way that the name Mia is spoken with a certain weight in the local history, in the fact that among the older residents there's a collective memory of that October, of the searches, of the lanterns in the dark between the trees, of the way the town changed and never quite changed. Back. The maple trees on the road where Mia used to ride are still there. Some of them are the same trees. Maples can live for a very long time, and several of the largest ones along that stretch have been growing since before 1957. They were there when she rode past. They were there when the search parties moved through them. They were there for every autumn after that. Every October when the leaves turned the same red and gold that they turned on the morning she disappeared. They're still there now. There's something both terrible and consoling about that. Terrible because the trees are indifferent. They do not remember. They do not grieve. They simply grow, and in growing they become a kind of passive testimony to how much time has passed and how completely ordinary time can make even the most extraordinary absence. Consoling because they connect this moment to that one, because they're a physical thread running back to the morning when Mia Thompson rode between them with a pink ribbon in her hair and the whole world still in front of her. They're a reminder that the past is not as far away as it seems, that the distance between 1957 and today is shorter than the silence suggests. One of the things that distinguishes this case from many cold cases of its era is the existence of Margaret Thompson's documentation. The little notebook, the letters, the organized, annotated case file that she maintained on her kitchen table for decades. When the journalist requested the complete case record from the county archive, she found not only the official documents, but also a substantial collection of Margaret Thompson's personal correspondence and notes, which had been donated to the County Historical Society by a relative after Margaret's death and had been transferred to the case file at some point during the early years of renewed interest in the case. Reading through them, the journalist described the experience as one of the most affecting of her professional life. Not because Margaret's notes contained anything that had previously been overlooked, though she examined them carefully for exactly that reason, but because of the quality of attention they demonstrated. The precision, the refusal to give up, the patient, year-by-year accumulation of everything that had been done and everything that had not been done, annotated in a handwriting that remained consistent for decades, and then became slightly less certain in the last years before Margaret's death, though no less organized. There was an entry in the notebook dated October 14, 2003, 46 years to the day after Mia's disappearance. Margaret would have been 80 years old. The entry was brief. It noted that she had called the sheriff's department that morning, as she did every year on the anniversary, and had been told, as she was told every year, that there were no new developments. She noted this without apparent bitterness. And then she wrote, in the careful handwriting of a woman who had spent a lifetime believing that details mattered and that nothing should slip through the cracks, a single sentence. She wrote, "Someone will find the thread eventually. I have to believe that." She died the following year. Someone found the thread. The broader implications of this case reached beyond Mill Creek and beyond the specific circumstances of Mia Thompson's disappearance. They reach into the question of how we handle cold cases, institutionally, culturally, practically, and what the rediscovery of cases like this one tells us about the gaps in the system. The property survey document that contained the critical notation had been in the case file for more than 60 years. It was not hidden. It was not classified. It was not inaccessible. It was sitting in a manila folder in a filing cabinet, available to any investigator who requested the file and read it thoroughly. The information it contained was specific, locatable, and actionable. All it required was someone who read every page. This is not a story about a failure of technology. It is not a story about resources, though underfunding of cold case units is a real and serious issue. It is a story about attention, about the kind of sustained, thorough, unpresumptuous attention that treats every document as potentially significant rather than filtering the file for what seems most relevant and moving on. There are thousands of cold cases in filing cabinets across the country. Thousands of manila folders containing documents that have not been read thoroughly since they were first added to the record, sometimes decades ago, sometimes longer. Some of those documents contain, in all likelihood, the equivalent of a surveyor's note, a single line, an aside, a factual observation made by someone doing an unrelated job who noticed something and wrote it down and assumed that the people whose job it was to notice would notice. Some of those lines have never been read by the right person. Some of them are waiting. This is the argument that advocates for cold case units make consistently and with ample supporting evidence. That reinvestigation is not a luxury, but a necessity. That new eyes on old files find things that old eyes missed. That the accumulation of time and technology and methodology makes it possible to close cases that once seemed permanently open. The case of Mia Thompson is, among other things, a demonstration of what that argument looks like in practice. Raymond Holt grew up in western Pennsylvania, in a small town not entirely unlike Mill Creek. He was one of several children. His father worked in the mines. His mother kept house. By the accounts that investigators have been able to assemble through interviews with distant relatives and historical records, he was a quiet child, not especially socialized, given to spending time alone in ways that his siblings found unremarkable, but that the adults in his life apparently did not press on. He served a brief period in the military in the late 1940s, was discharged under conditions that have not been publicly specified, and spent the early part of the 1950s moving between small towns in Pennsylvania, doing mechanical work, staying for a while, and then moving on. He arrived in Mill Creek around 1949 and stayed longer there than he had stayed anywhere. 8 years, long enough to be known if not truly known, long enough to establish a routine and a reputation and a garage with a steady enough clientele to sustain him. He did not have close friends. He did not have a romantic partner at any point during his time in Mill Creek, by any account anyone has been able to find. He existed in the community as a peripheral figure, present, functional, earning his living, and fundamentally separate from the social fabric of the town in a way that people noticed without knowing exactly what to do with. After he left Mill Creek in October of 1957, the trail goes cold for nearly a decade. Investigators working the current reinvestigation have been able to establish, through a combination of forensic genealogy and archival research, a general outline of his movements. A different name, a different state, a different city, but the specifics of where he was and what he was doing in those years are still being assembled from fragmentary records. What is clear is that he did not stop working as a mechanic. He did not disappear into hermitage. He simply became someone else and kept living. He is old now. Whatever he has carried for 68 years, he has carried it into old age, into whatever daily life looks like for a man in his late 80s who is living under a name that is not his own, in a place that has nothing to do with Mill Creek or the Thompson family or the Maple Line Road where a little girl disappeared on an October morning in 1957. The investigators who know where he is have not yet moved on him in the way that would be required for charges to be filed. The process is not finished. The evidence is still being assessed, still being prepared, still being reviewed by the legal teams who will ultimately determine whether there is sufficient grounds for prosecution and whether prosecution is procedurally viable given the subject's age and health. These are not rhetorical considerations. In American law, the right to a fair trial includes the right to a trial that the accused is competent to participate in. Age and cognitive decline are legally relevant factors. The question of what justice looks like for a man who may be in his late 80s, who may have diminished capacity, who committed an act 68 years ago, if he committed it, is not a question with a clean answer, and anyone who tells you it is oversimplifying. But there are other forms that accountability can take. There is the formal naming, the public record, the confirmation of what happened, even in the absence of a prison sentence. There is the closing of the file, the official, documented, legally supported determination that this is what happened to Mia Thompson on this date, in this place, by this person. There is the possibility, however late and however incomplete, of the family record being corrected, of the history being set straight. And there is something that exists outside of the legal system entirely, the simple human fact of being found, of a truth catching up, of the silence being broken after 68 years by someone reading every page. It is worth pausing here to consider what it means to investigate a case this old, not in the technical or procedural sense. We have covered that, but in the human sense. What does it mean to immerse yourself in a world that is 68 years gone? To read the statements of witnesses who are now dead, to hold the case file of a family that no longer exists, to walk a road that has changed in 100 ways since the morning you are trying to reconstruct? The investigative journalist has spoken about this with a directness that is worth reflecting on. She said that working on cases of this age requires a particular kind of imaginative discipline, the ability to hold the past as real, as fully real, as present and specific and populated with living people, without romanticizing it or allowing the passage of time to smooth over its roughness and particularity. History has a way of becoming abstract. People who are gone become photographs, documents, names. The task of the cold case investigator, and the task of anyone telling this story, is to resist that abstraction, to keep insisting on the specificity of the people involved. Mia Thompson was not a symbol. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a placeholder for all the children who go missing or all the cases that go cold or all the mothers who spend their lives writing letters to filing cabinets. She was a 5-year-old girl who loved to draw, who ate toast at a kitchen table while a children's program played on a radio, who asked her father if he had the night shift, who rode a red bicycle and carried a sketchbook and had gray eyes and a pink ribbon in her hair. She was that, specifically and irreducibly, in no account of this case that loses sight of that specificity is telling the truth. Margaret Thompson's piano students, in the years after Mia's disappearance, have been interviewed over the decades by various journalists and researchers. Many of them were young children at the time, now elderly people with their own children and grandchildren and the long perspective that comes from having survived a full life. They remember Margaret in terms that are remarkably consistent across all those separate accounts. Her patience, her precision, her ability to maintain a kind of composed and functional presence, even in the years when the loss she was carrying was most acute. She never canceled lessons. She never let her grief bleed into the living room in ways that made her students feel they were intruding on it. She was, they say, entirely present in those hours, attentive to the music, attentive to them, reliable in the way that people who have decided to endure tend to be reliable. But there was one thing that several of her students mentioned independently of each other, in different interviews, years apart, that they had never compared notes on, and that created a kind of quiet coherence across their separate memories. When a lesson ended and a student was getting ready to leave, Margaret always walked them to the door. She always watched them go down the path and onto the road. She watched until they were out of sight. Every time, every student, for decades. She never stopped watching them go. The town of Mill Creek has a historical society now, run by volunteers, that maintains records and photographs and artifacts from the town's history going back to its founding. Among the items in their collection is a framed copy of the photograph that appeared on the front page of the Huntington Daily News on October 15, 1957. The school photograph of Mia Thompson, gray eyes and blonde hair, and the not-quite smile that is trying to get itself right, the pink ribbon at the top of the frame. It is displayed in the Historical Society's reading room, on a wall near the window, where the light falls on it in the afternoons. There is a small type card beneath it that gives her name, her dates, and a single line of context. It does not mention Raymond Holt. It does not speculate about what happened. It does not anticipate the findings of the reinvestigation or the forensic discoveries that came decades after the photograph was taken and the newspaper was printed and the town began the long work of carrying its grief. It just shows her face, the gray eyes, the pink ribbon, the morning light of October 1957, which is the only light she is ever going to be in now, in the photographs and the records in the story. She was 5 years old. She would have been 73 this year. There's a question that runs underneath every telling of this case, and it has never been fully answered, and it may never be. Not because the facts are unavailable, but because the question itself is one that facts cannot entirely address. Is the question of why, not in the criminal sense. The investigative and forensic record, as it continues to develop, will presumably answer the what and the how with as much precision as is possible after 68 years. But in a larger sense, the sense that a 5-year-old girl riding a bicycle between maple trees on a clear October morning provokes in anyone who thinks about it long enough. Why do things like this happen? Why does the world contain people like Raymond Holt? Whoever Raymond Holt really is, whatever he carries, whatever made him into the person who did what he appears to have done. Why does a child disappear and a mother spend a lifetime waiting and a community carry a wound it cannot fully name? Why is the machinery of justice so slow, so fallible, so dependent on the accident of a journalist reading a footnote? These are not questions with answers. They are questions that the case opens and that we have to sit with. True crime, at its worst, uses these questions as hooks, the unanswerable horror as entertainment, the unresolvable grief as content. At its best, it holds the questions open in a way that does not resolve them into comfort, but insists that they continue to be asked, that the names continue to be spoken, that the faces, gray eyes, blonde hair, pink ribbon, continue to be kept specific and real. This channel exists because the cases matter, because the people in them were real, because cold does not mean closed, because someone will find the thread eventually if they read every page, if they keep going, if they do not permit the silence to become permanent. Margaret Thompson believed that. The investigative journalist proved it. And Mia Thompson, wherever she is, whatever the forensic process ultimately confirms, deserve to be found. We want to talk for a moment about the families of cold case victims. Not in the abstract, but in the specific ways that living with this kind of unresolved grief shapes a life. Thomas Thompson's trajectory, from the soldier who came home and built a quiet, steady life to the man who walked through a door and never quite came back from what he found on the other side of it, is one version of that trajectory. It is the version that ends in a relatively early death, in the particular way that prolonged grief does in some lives. Not dramatically, not singularly, but by a kind of slow subtraction. Margaret's trajectory is another version. The version where grief becomes, in some profound and unsentimental way, a project. Where the inability to stop becomes a form of sustaining. Where the little notebook and the organized file and the letters to the department are not symptoms of denial, but of a particular kind of love that does not know how to exist without purpose. Both are valid responses to the unthinkable. Both are human. Both are what the families of missing children actually go through in the real and irreducible specificity of their individual lives, as opposed to the way those lives tend to look from the outside, as object lessons in grief, as supporting characters in a story whose main plot is the crime itself. The families are not supporting characters. This needs to be said clearly and without qualification in the context of a case like this one. The family is not the backdrop for the investigation. The family is not the emotional seasoning that makes the mystery more compelling. The Thompson family, Thomas and Margaret, and the particular specific life they had built together, and the particular specific child they had made together, and the particular specific way their lives were altered beyond recovery by what happened on October 14th, 1957. They are the center of this story. Everything else, the investigation, the suspect, the surveyor's note, the journalist, the forensic genealogy, the reinvestigation, all of it is in service of a story that is ultimately about three people in a white-painted house with a weathered tin roof, and what was taken from them, and what was kept from them for far too long. Let us return, one final time, to the morning. Let us go back to the kitchen, where the radio plays and the coffee is strong, and the smell of toast is still in the air. Where Thomas Thompson reads the newspaper, and Margaret makes breakfast, and Mia sits at the table with her sketchbook on the chair beside her, because some habits are too ingrained to break, even for meals. Let us sit with that morning for a moment. The light coming through the windows. The children's program on the radio. The ordinary weight of a Tuesday in October in a small Pennsylvania town where nothing terrible has ever happened and nothing terrible is supposed to happen. Thomas will stand up from the table and kiss his daughter on the forehead. He does not know it is the last time. He cannot know. He is a man going to work on a Tuesday morning, doing what he always does, present and reliable, and entirely unaware that the whole architecture of his life is about to change. Margaret will retie the pink ribbon and help Mia into her backpack and wheel out the red bicycle. She will stand in the yard and watch her daughter ride away between the maple trees, the ribbon catching the light, smaller and smaller until she turns the bend. She does not know either. No one knows. That is the unbearable heart of it. Not the crime, not the suspect, not the investigation, not the 68 years of silence. The unbearable heart is that moment in the yard. Margaret watching, Mia riding, the morning completely ordinary and completely safe and completely unaware of what it is about to become. That moment happened. It was real. It contained a little girl with gray eyes and a pink ribbon in her hair, and the whole rest of her life still presumably ahead of her. And it ended. And what ended, it was not an act of God or a natural disaster or the random entropy of a universe indifferent to human life. It was a person, a man who made a choice, who chose to take a 5-year-old girl from her bicycle and from her sketchbook and from her pink ribbon and from her mother and her father and from every single morning that should have followed that one. That is the truth of this case. And it is the truth that the reinvestigation and the forensic process and the legal proceedings that may or may not result in formal charges are all aimed at confirming and establishing and putting on the record that Mia Thompson was here, that she mattered, that what happened to her was not a disappearance in a silence, but an act for which someone is accountable. 68 years. But the thread was there, and someone found it. Before we close out this story tonight, there is one more thing worth saying. If you're a parent, or a teacher, or a neighbor, or anyone who moves through the world with children in it, and that is most of us, the story of Mia Thompson asks something of you. Not a dramatic something, not a call to arms or a manifesto. Something quieter and more specific. It asks you to pay attention to the things that feel slightly wrong, to the pauses at intersections, to the watching that goes on too long, to the instinct that tells you something is not right even when you have no evidence to point to, no words to attach to it, no official channel through which to transmit it. Emma Fielding had an instinct. She had it in the moment, a green truck moving too slowly, pausing, turning. She walked away from it because she had no framework for taking it anywhere. We have better frameworks now. We have better language. We have better tools, better infrastructure, better awareness of the specific behaviors and patterns that should prompt a second look. We have, in the decades since 1957, learned a great deal about how to trust and act on the quiet signals that something is wrong. Pay attention. Trust those signals. Say something, even when it feels like an overreaction, even when you cannot fully articulate why. The cost of being wrong is a brief, embarrassing moment. The cost of being right and saying nothing is something else entirely. This is what Emma Fielding has said in every interview she ever gave in the years when she was still alive to give them. Not as self-condemnation. She never blamed herself in any way that was fair or proportionate, but as the practical conclusion drawn from 68 years of replaying a moment at an intersection. She said it simply, directly, without drama. If you see something, say something, even if it turns out to be nothing. Especially if it turns out to be nothing, because the times when it is not nothing are the times when it matters most. There is a detail about the morning of October 14th, 1957, that has not yet been mentioned in this telling, but that appears in Margaret Thompson's notebook and in her subsequent interviews, and that seems important to include. When Mia was getting ready to leave that morning, backpack on, ribbon retied, standing at the door while Margaret held the bicycle, she said something to her mother. It was the last thing she said, the last exchange they had before Mia rode away and did not come back. She told her mother that she was going to draw the leaves on the way to school. The October leaves, red and gold on the maple trees, the ones that made the road look like something worth capturing. She had drawn them the week before and had not been satisfied with the result. She told Margaret she was going to try again today. She had a theory about the way the light hit them in the morning. A theory expressed in the language of a 5-year-old who did not have art vocabulary, but had the thing art vocabulary is built to describe. Margaret said, "All right." She told her to be careful. Mia rode away. The sketchbook was in her backpack. It was never found. Whatever she drew, or was going to draw, on that road between those trees on that October morning, it is gone. The record she kept of the world she observed, the specific, curious, attentive record of a child who found everything worth drawing. It ended that morning, on a road between maple trees in a town in Pennsylvania, 68 years ago. That is the last thing. That is the one that is hardest to hold. The case of Mia Thompson remains open. The investigation is active. The legal process is moving forward. The forensic analysis continues. The name of Raymond Holt is known to investigators in at least 2 states. The file is no longer cold. Her mother always said someone would find the thread eventually. She was right. We will continue to cover this case as developments emerge. If you have any information relevant to this investigation, anything, no matter how small or how old, the Huntingdon County Sheriff's Department is the appropriate contact, and their information is available through the county website and through the links in the description below. And now, from all of us at CrimeTime, Cold Case, this is from Mia Thompson. Gray eyes, blonde hair, pink ribbon, 5 years old, in Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, on the 14th of October, 1957. Who loved to draw? Who asked her father if he had the night shift? Who was going to draw the leaves? We see you. We remember you. And we are not going to stop until the whole truth is on the record. If this story moved you, if you believe, as we do, that cold cases deserve to be reopened, that the details matter, that the names and faces of the people in these files deserve to be kept real and specific and human, then this is what we ask of you. Like this video, leave a comment, tell us where you are watching from tonight, and tell us what you think should happen next in this case. Should Raymond Holt face formal charges, regardless of his age? Should the county issue a formal acknowledgement of the investigative failures that allowed this case to go cold for so long? What does justice look like 68 years later for a 5-year-old girl who rode away on a red bicycle and never came home? These are your questions to answer. This is your community, and your engagement, every comment, every share, every subscription, is what allows us to keep doing this work, to keep reading every page, to keep pulling every thread, to keep going back to the cases that the system let go cold and asking, what did we miss? What is still there in the file, waiting to be found? Subscribe to CrimeTime Cold Case. Hit the notification bell, because we are not done. We will never be done. No case stays cold forever. We will see you next time. CrimeTime Cold Case, because every name deserves an answer.